What I'd like to do is just walk through some token scenarios, if you will, or things, ways that I've seen tokens being used or asked about tokens. The first thing that was brought up just the other day was what's the very minimum amount of information that we could have in a token that's used from Microsoft Identity. So let me just clear off a couple of things here. So what we're going to do here is just get the very minimum amount of information in an ID token. Now, we won't talk too much about access tokens, although most of this information could be in or out of an access token as well. But this came up from a customer who was very concerned about the privacy of their users, not just for applications that they're purchasing, but even for their internal applications. So let's go ahead here, and I'm going to use the protocol here. I'm just going to use OpenID Connect. And the only scope I'm asking for here is OpenID. So OpenID Connect is a standard built on top of OAuth 2 that you can use for authentication. And that's what we build an awful lot of our authentication inside of Microsoft Identity on. It's our volume leader, if you will. We also support, of course, SAML and WS Fed. But for new applications, we always talk about OpenID Connect. So I'm going to go ahead and use an OpenID Connect request here to sign in a user. Now, this is the very first time this application has been used. I just recently deleted the service principal, so no one's used this application up till now. So we'll see some consent prompts. And this is the very basic information. You see there's two permissions that are here. The first one is maintain my access and view my basic profile. So all I've asked here is to authenticate the user. So my permissions are going to be very minimal here. I can view my profile, but I'm actually not asking for permission to access Microsoft Graph. I wouldn't see that in my access token, or my ID token rather. But I'm just going to get the absolute minimum amount of information. Now, one little thing you can do if you want to make yourself sort of a token viewer, so you can look at various scopes that you request in your tokens to see what the outcome is to have your application redirect. A web-based application like this that's using implicit flow, simply redirect to the jwt.ms site, and we will take the token, as you can see up here in the address bar. This link has an ID token in it, so the jwt.ms site will grab that token, put it into its text box here, and look at my decoded. So it's a quick and easy way, if you want, to do a quick view of a token. Now, this is the bare minimum that we would provide for an authentication. So the only thing I asked to do was sign in the user. So the only scope in this request was OpenID, and this is the information. I do have identifiable information about the user in that I can see this subject claim, SUB, the subject claim, and that's a unique identifier for this user for this application. So the same user uses a different application, it would be a different subject claim. But here I can see the subject of the claim, so I know each user uniquely to my application. I also, of course, can see the tenant, but I get that both from who issued the token. It came from a particular tenant issuer, and I see that tenant ID here as well. And this is the absolute minimum information. Now, this is a great token if all you wanted to drive was make sure that you were driving toward ultimate privacy. This particular company was being asked by its European Union Workers' Council to make information about their internal users minimally available to other processes within their organization, so internal line of business apps, if you will. And this would provide a great privacy option. Now, I will point out, this is not something that we default in our MSOL libraries. MSOL, we always tag on additional OpenID Connect scope, which is profile. So if I sign this user in using the profile scope as well, so this would be OpenID and profile, I will get some additional information. Key amongst these is the object ID. So instead of a subject, I still get my subject, which is the same one, of course, but I get my object ID. The object ID here is a unique identifier for this user across all applications. So this does allow multiple applications to know that they're working with the same user. Additionally, I get some other claims here. I get a name claim and a preferred username claim. Those are things that might change over time. Users could change either one of those, and they are sort of things that do cross multiple boundaries as far as applications. Again, though, it's a pretty good token with respect to privacy. There's not too much I know here. I do have a user name, but I don't have a lot of other information about the user. And finally, to look at this one more way, we also have the email OpenID Connect claim. So I'll sign the user in using that. In this case, notice that I dropped the profile information, so I no longer have that object ID, the unique across all apps identifier, but I do have an email identifier. But while that might be unique across apps, it's not a great identifier to use as a key since that's a changeable object, right? That claim, I can change my email tomorrow, and then you'd think I have a different user, although the subject, of course, would remain. So those are the basic tokens that OpenID provides, that are at least dictated by the OpenID Connect spec. These particular scopes, OpenID profile and email, are done by there, and these are the sort of absolute minimum, if you will, if you are looking to drive privacy within your organization. There is one more I'll quickly do here that I could, of course, sign in with all three of those scopes. So this is OpenID, email, and profile. And in this case, you do see all of that information that is baseline, if you will. Notice at no point between any of those prompts, I signed in now 4 different ways, OpenID Connect on its own. That was the first time this application was used. I got a permission consent request to see my basic profile information. But then from whether or not the application asked to just see profile or just see email or to see email and profile, we consider that all a single permission. So the user isn't prompted. If you just change from I want just email to email and profile, the user isn't prompted as an additional consent because we see that as all the first part of the basic consent, the basic profile information. So this is a way if you were trying to drive additional privacy or concerns of access to information within your organization, and all you needed to do was authenticate the user, these are some claims that are tokens that you can do just to see that. So let me take a look. I'm going to jump over to an application here and look at a couple of other authentications. So in this case, this application lets me fiddle around with the various scopes that I'm going to use for signing in. In this case, I'm going to ask for no additional scopes. Now this application does use msol.net, so we'll see what I get from a token where I'm asking for no scopes when I sign in, but what msol will default in for me. So let's go ahead and sign in. We'll sign in that same user again. So this is the user we used on the web pages, and we see without asking for any additional scopes, I see an object ID, I see a name, I see the preferred username. Of course, the same subject, I'm using the same application identifier here. This is clearly a token that was generated because the application, in this case through msol, asked for OpenID Connect and profile. So if you use our msol libraries, this is the minimum token that you could get by using our msol libraries. So this is, again, without asking. Notice I don't get that email claim because no one asked for email. Right, so one of the ways I could ask to see the user's email as well is I could use that as my sign-in scope. So I'll go ahead and sign the user out, sign the user back in again. I'm just using sign out to this particular application, so the user isn't being signed out of the device, so that saves you having to watch my passwordless authentication again. But here, as a developer, I've asked to see an additional claim email, and therefore that shows up in my claim, assuming the user has that email provided and its information available to the system. So this lets my application as a developer start to say, well, I'd like to see various other information about the user in the token. Let's take a look at some of the different ways that these users might manifest themselves. So I'm going to sign out of this application for the corporate user I've been using. Notice I'm using the common endpoint. So this means I'm taking any user from whether they have a Microsoft corporate account or they have a Microsoft consumer account like Outlook, etc. I'm going to go back to asking for nothing in the sign-in scope. So I signed the user out of the app. I'm going to sign in the user, but this time I'm going to go ahead and sign in a user from my Microsoft account, a personal account. So we'll go ahead here and sign in. Now, again, this is the first time this user has ever seen this application. So I'm being asked if I trust the developer with this information. Again, it's viewing my basic profile because I haven't asked for any additional scopes. And now I will go ahead and grant that consent. And here we can see that I get, again, that very basic level of information. I have a name, I have a preferred username, and I have an object ID for this tenant. Now, this particular tenant, 918, is telling me that this user is coming from a Microsoft consumer account. So this token is issued for this user for this particular, as their Microsoft identity themselves. So I'm accessing this application as a consumer. I'll go ahead and sign that user out of this app as a consumer. And now, even though this is a multi-tenant app, I'm given choices about how I can sign a user in. So for example, I could say I only want consumers or they only want people with business accounts. But in this case, I'm going to sign this user in. I'm going to sign in and I'm going to say I want only users from this particular tenant. So a multi-tenant account allows me as a developer to get users from any tenant or all Microsoft consumer accounts if that's what I choose. But I could also, even though it's a multi-tenant registration, say I'm signing in a user from a particular tenant only. And I'm going to sign in that same user. And in this case, so we'll go back here and we'll pick Kyle Mar Demo as the consumer account. And now, interesting that this user is being shown this application again. That's because I'm signing in from this particular tenant. So it's what's happening here is I'm not signing in Kyle from his consumer account. I'm signing in Kyle from this particular tenant. Now, it turns out that Kyle from this particular tenant has an identity that's being authenticated back to his consumer account. So what that tells me as a developer is this is a guest user in this tenant. So I only want users from a particular tenant, but so that allows anyone who has an identity in that tenant. And in this case, my consumer account has an identity in this tenant as a guest. So notice that there are different values in the claims here. So instead of my Kyle Marsh, I've got my name Kyle from Outlook. That's showing me that I'm coming from the name I've used inside of this tenant is that I'm coming from my consumer account. It's a different subject, even though it's the same person and I'm using the same authentication provider. It's a different subject because it's not Kyle as a consumer, it's Kyle as a guest in this tenant. And it's the guest in this tenant that's controlling my access to the various resources that this tenant provides. One other way that I could see that this, now most of the information I'm looking at here doesn't tell me necessarily that this user is a guest, right? Everybody has a name, everybody has an object ID issued from this particular tenant. Where I can see that this user is a guest is that I also have an IDP claim in this token. This is telling me that this user is actually homed, if you will, or doing their authentication, the username and password or passwordless or MFA, et cetera, is coming from their home tenant where my authentication provider really is. So here I can see that my IDP in this case is a Microsoft consumer tenant. So this is telling me this user is a guest here. If I had another Microsoft consumer account or an enterprise account, I would see a different IDP provider. Now that may not be interesting to most developers because I think it's fairly rare for a developer to say, I need to operate differently if this user is a guest. Now there may be parts, maybe your application does need to know that a user is a guest and should therefore only have some functionality. But in general, you would be able to just see that information there. I'm going to pop back over to the web page again and go ahead and sign in a user. Anyone tell me what, when I sign in, I'm just going to go ahead and get my OpenID profile here. Anyone want to tell me what this token is telling me about the user? You can chime in on the text or go ahead and text in. Yeah, so Google is the IDP. So this particular user is coming from Google as a guest in this tenant. So I'm still signing in. So my issuer here is a Microsoft corporate tenant. There's my C72. That's my little demo tenant here. And yes, this user is a guest. I can see he's coming. He has an IDP. So he's not natively authenticating here in this tenant. and it happens to be authenticating to Google, and the other information I would have, I have an object ID. Well, I didn't ask for an object ID. Let me go ahead and ask for profile here so that I get an object ID. There's my object ID. Because I only asked for OpenID Connect, I didn't get an object. If use our MSOL or default in, we'll default in profile. So there's my object ID, etc. Right. So this tells me that this user is coming from a guest tenant. So there's a question about the little demo app I'm using, the toy app. Yeah, it's up on GitHub. I'll post a link to it at the end of the meeting. But these web pages here are just links where the redirect URI is jwt.ms. I can certainly post these particular queries or responses if you want. For example, you can see one here. It's just a regular OpenID Connect string. I'll certainly be happy to post those as well. All that changes between these particular links is simply the scope that we put on the request. Unfortunately, you can't see it in the expansion there, but that's all that we're changing here between those. So that lets me see what I can, if I needed to determine if a user was a guest. I can also, by the way, let me look at the token response here. Here in the token response, I can also get this information. A token response is a great place to get debugging information and additional information as you're trying to troubleshoot. Here I can see that the user's home account identifier is this particular tenant. So here I can see it's also a consumer account. I get the user's email, the token expiration, the correlation ID, again, a great thing for you to be logging so that we can understand any area of a particular transaction. And then, of course, I've got the actual unique identifier, the object ID and tenant ID that the user's there. So the token response is always a great place to get that information. Let's see. So yeah, so guest users. Let me go back to my Google guest user because there's a question about the email. I didn't ask for email. So as we talked about at the beginning, in this case, I'm driving it through OpenID Connect. So my OpenID link is only asking for the very minimum information. I don't even have an object ID here. All I get is scope. If I ask for profile, which we default in for you when you use MSOL, I do get my object ID as well as name and preferred username. And if I did want email, I can ask for it either on its own or in conjunction with profile. So let's do that as if I was using MSOL here. And here I will get an email as long as the system understands what the email for this user is. So email is not something that's on by default. If you use MSOL, we default in profile. We default in OpenID and profile whenever you use MSOL. I specifically wanted to call that out here as that. I wasn't planning on drilling into any access tokens here, although the claim values here are much the same, whether they send to an access or an ID token. We could look at those, but if we get time at the end, I could try to adjust for that. Let's see, I've got another question here. I'm not sure what, is it on by default? If that's referring to email, email is not on by default. You have to ask for it one way or another. And yes, I'm going to get to some customization of these tokens in just a minute. So let's go back to our little app. So you've seen here that I can sign in a user as a guest as well, both in our webpage and here, and I can see different responses because of that. So let's go back to our app registration. So here's the application registration for our little token trick app. What I'm going to do now is take a look at our token configuration preview, which allows us to start adding some custom capabilities for our token without having to go what we've been doing before, was requiring you to go and edit the manifest. So let's look at the optional claims that are available. So the first thing it's going to ask me is whether I'm asking for the optional claims that are going to be in my ID or access token. Since I'm set up to do ID tokens right now, let's go ahead and pick that. And here you can see I could have asked for email to be part of a custom claim through this process. I could also ask for these additional values like family name, given name, and SID, session ID. So let's go ahead and add those since, well, we can add email, although we're already asking for that. We'll go ahead and add that in. So now these are available as custom claims. So let me go back to my application. I'll sign out this user. And let's go ahead here and we'll sign in. Let's sign in my corporate user again. Sometimes it takes a minute for this to propagate. So let's see if we have, oh, here we are. We've got our email, of course. There's my family name and given name, as well as my SID. So if I wanted to add these custom claims, one way to easily do that now is with our preview functionality here in token configuration. So that's one thing. I can add some optional claims. Another thing I can look at is, let me go here. We do have a list of optional claims available as well in the documentation. So you can come and we will provide, let's see, let me get our optional claims. These are all the various other optional claims that you can ask for. Some of these we've built into the UI already. Some of them might still be coming. The other option here is that I could go to my application registration, and I could have looked, if I go here, let's cancel out of that. I'll come down here to the manifest, and you can see how we've been adding the optional claims into the manifest down here. Here are my optional claims. I want them in my ID token, and I could do some additional claims from this list in that same process. So if we don't have it already built into the UI, you can go in and add some more given the information here on the optional claim list. So that lets me add some, so now we've added these optional claims. Let's do another round here. We'll go back to the registration, our token configuration preview. So one is optional claim straight up. The other one is to help add for the groups claim. So there's some interesting capabilities. Again, we do have a link to the documentation, so you can jump right out to it. We're going to customize our ID token. So the first choice we get is, what kind of of groups am I looking for? Do I want just security groups? Do I want all groups? And do I want directory roles or not? Let's go ahead and start with just security groups. And here I have a choice of what identifier I want to see. Now I'm going to leave it at group ID because the SAM account names require when things come from on-premise. My domain, my tenant here is cloud only. But I will, so let me go first, and I'm just going to take a look at this group claim. So I'll add that. So now I've added the request. Now I can ask for these to appear in either access or ID tokens. So it's easy for you to, depending upon where you expect to get the token, whether you're an API provider, expect to see it in an access token, or whether you're an application and expect to see it in your ID token, you can manipulate both of those. So let's go back to, I'll go ahead and sign out this user. We're going to sign back in again. We'll take the corporate identity. We'll get our new ID token here. And we should see, let's see, who am I? I'm Kyle at Microsoft Identity. So I should have groups. Let me go ahead and check that. So let's sign out again. Sometimes it does take a moment for this to propagate. I noticed that last night. Let's see, we got our groups. Sure, we got this in. We're going to go to the group ID. Okay. And let's go ahead and run that again. Pretty sure I'm a member of some groups, but I might be wrong here. Let me go ahead and do yeah, I think I'm a member of groups. So let's sign out. Hopefully I'm not getting hit by the cache here. Let me check here. I've got my groups. I'm gonna edit this. I'm gonna go ahead and change to admit this to roles just so I can see if they're there. We'll save that. So I do have two options for how I see my groups. One is that I can see the groups just as a list of group claims. The other way is that I can say, instead of seeing groups as I'd like to convert these into being roles directly. Yeah, so we do see the conversion to roles. So here I can see that I have roles that are effectively group identifiers. So this is one way for you to say, I know which groups the user, my groups, I understand which groups will apply to which roles. It's just a way for you to decide whether you as a developer want to process this off of a groups claim or a roles claim. It is given to you as a choice is either one. So let's go ahead and I'm going to show one other thing here with groups though. There is issues with groups that you should be aware of. That is that we do have a token growth concern with groups in terms of how many groups you might be a part of. Now, Kyle at Microsoft Identity.dev isn't a member of any particular number of groups. There's only a couple there. Instead, for example, if I sign in, let's go ahead and sign in my corporate account from Microsoft itself, who's also signed into this device at the moment. Again, never seen the app before, so I'll go ahead and sign this user in. And here you can see that I do get my roles. So here, again, I've signed in this user, but I've signed in this user from this particular tenant. So Kyle from Microsoft here is only seen in one group or one role because I'm assigning this user in as a guest. Let's sign the user out, and we'll switch back over to the common endpoint. Sign in Kyle again. Notice when I was prompted a moment ago and I was given the opportunity to consent for everyone in my tenant. That's because Kyle, as a guest user in this tenant, does have admin privileges. Kyle at Microsoft does not, but I do run into the problem I face with groups, even though I'm asking for them to be admitted as roles, which is Kyle is a member of too many groups. Inside of Microsoft, when you work in a big company like Microsoft, you tend to be joined to lots and lots of groups, whether you know about them or not. And here I can see that I'd have too many groups to see, so I have to do my group overage claim. So there is an issue with groups that can be avoided if you go to the pure role process. But you can see here the different ways that a token can be affected because of how I'm signing in, right? So again, if I sign in, let's sign in my consumer user one more time as a consumer to this application. Notice I'm acting on my own behalf here. So I'm Kyle Mardemo at Outlook. I'm deciding as a consumer whether this application gets to see my email address or not, and I get that token. So here I can see the token that tells me that this user is being issued from this tenant. There's no ID provider here, so it is this user here. And again, we've got our extra claims here that we asked for. I still see family name and SID as a family name, given name, and SID as those optional claims that we asked for. Noticed I did get prompted for email because that's another claim that we added this way. If I sign this user out as a consumer and say, is this user available to access this corporate tenant, I can sign in again using my consumer identity, but my token for this same user will look somewhat different. Sure, I might have the same family name and given name. I'll have a different name because this is the name that's been assigned to me within this tenant. So it's not Kyle Marsh, it's Kyle from Outlook because that's what the tenant set here. And I do have an alternate identity provider. So I wanted this morning just to do a quick sort of look at a couple of things. First off, the different ways that you can add additional information into your tokens, and also just what we can do as an absolute minimum. I'm seeing some enterprises getting very concerned about privacy for their users. So the idea is what's the least that we can provide in a token. So if I look at say the default email profile from OpenID Connect, of course I am asked for roles as well, so I would turn those off. This gives us an idea of if you are concerned about the privacy of your users, how much information, how little personal information could you provide to an application developer if you're concerned about the privacy of your users and access to other data. And then just taking a look at some of the things that we can do with respect to adding additional items into your tokens. I do want to make one quick reiteration. I know I covered this on my last talk, but there are some golden rules you should be following with respect to tokens. First off, that you need to make sure you only use them for their intended function. The spec writers have spent a lot of time determining what vulnerabilities there are, what mitigations there are, but they're always doing it in respect to the token is being used for its particular purpose. So an ID token is only to be used to identify the user to the application that asked for it and nothing else. Similarly, an access token gives you a particular API, your application, the right to call a particular API with a particular range of operation. The second rule is easier, never mess with someone else's token. If your client ID or API ID is not the audience, it's not your token. You shouldn't be playing with it. The ways we see these broken most often is applications trying to look inside of access tokens. Access tokens are for APIs. They're not for you to manipulate or to make decisions on inside of an application. We see APIs either we see two ways of misusing the ID token. Either APIs accepting an ID token as an access token, which really just means your API has no protection of its own because it's just accepting an ID token, so you don't know whether the user should have access to your resource. And as enterprises are looking for ever more sophistication in the way they protect their users and their resources, we're saying your resources don't get to be protected in the way that enterprises want to protect things today. Things like conditional access policies can't be applied. And the same thing applies if an API says, well, as long as I get an access token that works for any API, it should work for me. Again, you're not protecting your API. You're not allowing your enterprise to properly protect your situation either. So we get a lot of requests of, could I do this with a token or could I do that with a token? If it's not your token, you shouldn't be messing with it. So an API should never accept an access token for another API because it's not their token. That audience has to be for your component. The audience claim has to match up with your client ID if you're an app, or your client ID / API ID if you're an API. Make sure you cache tokens appropriately. Yes, our MSOL libraries, of course, handle this by default. We issue tokens that are valid for a particular amount of time as specified in the token, and you can see in the token response. You don't have to look in the token to find that information. If you keep asking for tokens over and over again, sure, we might provide them, but we also might look at your application and start saying it's something that we need to throttle because you're using the system inappropriately. And then finally, as you look at tokens, there's really one common transaction you as a developer have to keep in mind. You ask for a token, you either get the token or you don't. If you don't get the token, you have to fail over gracefully, whatever that means. There's a myriad of reasons you may not get that token nowadays. You may not get consent. Maybe there's a conditional access policy being applied because of the resource that's being accessed. There's a lot of sophistication and that's going into protecting these valuable resources. So you always have to assume there may be at any point in time you're not going to get a token. So you have to make sure you fail over gracefully. But that's the only transaction you have with us. Can I have a token? We either give you a token or not. Your control over that request is, here is the scope. Here is the reason I'm asking for this token. I'd like to identify the user, so you use OpenID Connect. I'd like to access an API, so here's the scope to call that API. That's really the transactions that you have. If you start checking for specific errors, like, oh, the user needs to re-authenticate or consent is needed, you might miss a broader class, which is these. We might group all of those into saying, hey, these all mean that we need to talk to the user. So move from MSOL's acquired token silent into MSOL's acquired token interactive. So that's the idea of making sure that you code to the error classes, and therefore you won't have to miss a specific error code. So there's a question of how MSOL caches the token. I'd actually have to check, but it would depend on the token itself. Obviously, we don't actually have email in all tokens, and we also don't have object IDs in on tokens. So you have to be able to cache it depending upon what the information you get. Most of that information is going to come out of the token response anyway, depending. Well, if it's caching an access token, it has to cache off the information available in the response, the token response, as opposed to the information available in the token itself. So remember, we're not going to probably be cracking access tokens as they go by. That caching all happens based on the scopes and the user identifier that's in the token responses. So other questions? I see Hirsch is on the line. He's our token expert, by the way. I'm just someone who plays understanding tokens from time to time, but Hirsch is our token expert here. So thanks, Hirsch, for coming online. I see you've answered a bunch of questions. Are there any open questions or comments or questions anyone has?
I'll go ahead and ask verbally. I put it in the chat. You mentioned subject is generally abstracted to be application specific rather than spanning applications and differentiated from object ID in that regard. Is that something that came out of the spec, or is that a decision that AD has made? Because I've noticed B2C, the built-in flows and the default behavior for custom flows is object ID is returned as the subject. So I'm trying to figure out, are they taking a different decision with regards to that, or are they violating the spec?
I'd have to check to whether the spec is requiring subject to be application specific. B2C is a different beast, of course, because it's identity provider for the solution itself. So BDC has a very different point of view of the world. So for example, BDC doesn't have permission and consent prompts because the resource owner is the application itself, the solution itself, if you will. So the nature of B2C as an identity provider, I like to think of it as, instead of, we have Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Consumer accounts. And when an application chooses to sign in against those, they're saying, I'd like to use the identity and the infrastructure available from my customer, whether that's a user or a company. I'm asking to use their identity system. When I say I'm using a B2C solution, I'm saying I, as a solution provider, am having my own identity provider. So all of this is about me, right? So it has a different point of view on things like permission and consent, and certainly things like subject and object ID, since the solution is the identity provider. So it's got a closer connection there. So whether that's a violation of the spec, I'd have to check. But you can see it comes from a very different point of view with respect to who the source of the identity provider is. Does that make sense? Did I explain that at all?
A bit. I'm pausing to assimilate it all.
So there was a question above, what's the difference between the subject and the OID? In the case of our Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Consumers accounts, the object ID is a fixed identifier for this identity. Anyway, so the object ID is this fixed identity that will go against any application. Anytime you reference this identity, that object ID would be the same, regardless of any other changes that happen to that object. A subject is similar, but it's generated on a per application basis. So for every client ID, that user will have a specific subject, and it will be the same subject no matter other changes to the record. But if I go to a different application, that same user would get a different subject. So it allows me to share, to identify a user uniquely to an application, but not allow two applications to figure out it's the same user.
Hi, Kyle. Thanks for the explanation. This is Priyan. Hey. So I have a question on this subject. So as per the documentation, we can use the subject to identify the user in an application. That's what the Microsoft document says. But yes, how an application will get this subject information?
In the claim. So if I look at any of these claims here, there's always a subject. So here's the subject for whoever this is. This is Kyle Marr. This is my consumer account as a guest in this particular tenant. So here's this identity. So that in this case, I'm identifying Kyle as a guest in this tenant who happens to be using his consumer account, but that doesn't matter. Kyle as a guest in this tenant has this subject claim, SUB claim, in my ID token, which the application is given, and I will always get that subject for this application.
Thanks, Kyle. So what you are recommending is, whenever a user logs in and gets an ID token, store the subject somewhere so that we can reuse this. Or is there any other way we can get the subject before or preload this particular subject for the user authentication?
You can't know the subject until the user authenticates. We don't know who the user is. And once we know the user is, we'll tell you right away in the subject claim of the ID token. But there's no way for you to know ahead of time because no one's identified the user yet, who the subject might be. And it's not something the user would ever see or understand. It's there for you to use a key for a database lookup or however you want to identify this user. If you told your application developers to use subject, what you're saying is, I don't want you coordinating different actions across applications. The subject ID is enough for you to identify this user to the application. If you say you go ahead and use object ID, you're saying multiple applications could understand it's the same user because they would get the same object ID for the same user.
Thanks, Kyle. So are you recommending all the application teams to store the subject the moment the user logs in? After the first login, once you get an ID token, store the subject somewhere?
Assuming that you need to know when that user comes back, assuming that you have information to store on a per user basis, then yes, this is the key. So supposing this go do something very simple, you have a table there where you want this user set this attribute. The key to that table is either subject or object ID. And if you want to go with subject, that's great. So yes, the subject becomes the key you're going to use to look up whatever this user did the last time he was here.
Okay, thanks.
So if you have to store things on a per user basis, it's absolutely preferable that you use either subject or object ID, tenant ID, because object ID if you're a single tenant app, because those are unique identifiers that when that same user comes back, regardless of changing their name or email or anything else, when you have to say, what did that user do last time they were here? I key off of subject or I key off of object ID and I get that answer.
Thanks, Kate. I do have a separate question on a separate claim, that AMR values. So AMR value, I see that it's missing in the version 2 token, but it's available in version 1. So why that is missing in version 2?
So I know that we're looking at what our alternatives are to do that. There were some issues with the AMR, so we want to make sure we can do a better job of consistency and so on. So I know that it has been brought up as a question because lots of people were looking for AMR. They saw it in V1 and they are asking, what do I do to replicate the functionality or replicate the information I was getting from the AMR claim? So it is something we're looking at, but I don't have an answer to that right now.
Sure, thanks, Kyle.
So the question about sharing the link, I'll share a link to the little app I was using. I can also post those little links if you want. If you want to do the things I was doing in the browser, that's fine as well. I'll post all of those to the end of the conversation. It's a good question. I don't know if we're going to do extension attributes via the UI. You can do them in the manifest. I'll have to find out if we're going to be adding that to the UI as well. I think we're probably looking for more common ones there, but I'll have to check. So a different format today, not a lot of slides, just a lot of playing around with tokens. I hope it was interesting. Please let us know in the feedback if this was something that's interesting, or you'd prefer more formal approaches or more conversational or anything. We'd be happy, and thank you very much for your time today.